Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm State Senator Brad Hoylman. Good evening. We're live on Facebook for our virtual town hall tonight. I'm here with some special guests. We're talking tonight with Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal in our weekly virtual town halls on COVID-19. Tonight is an extension of both the health and humanitarian crisis that we're undergoing right now, which has quickly become an economic crisis for so many New Yorkers. As I'm sure many of our viewers know, if they themselves haven't applied for unemployment, they know someone who has. And 26 million Americans are part of that surge in unemployment applications, 1.4 million New Yorkers, and close to 250,000 just last week alone. And that leads to our discussion tonight, which is about the rent crisis. Because if you are unemployed and battling your health and trying to keep your family healthy, as well as your friends and loved ones, it's going to be hard to pay the rent. And so that's why our first guest is so important, because he has introduced legislation to address that issue directly. And our first guest is Senator Mike Gianaris. He serves as the Deputy Majority Leader and proudly represents Western Queens. He's been guided by the principle that government should level the playing field between everyday New Yorkers and powerful private interests. We know of the work Senator Gianaris did in battling Amazon out in Queens. Among his long career, though, he's fought for working class New Yorkers. He's authored critical legislation to improve affordable housing opportunities, to direct more money to our struggling transit system, to make voting easier and being more fair in the criminal justice arena. He sponsors the main legislation that we're discussing tonight to cancel rent in New York during the COVID-19 pandemic. Senator Gianaris was born and raised in Astoria, Queens, where he continues to reside, which is a good thing given that he represents the area. And he's the product of New York City Public Schools, graduated from Fordham University and Harvard Law School. Welcome, Senator Gianaris.
Thank you, Senator Hoylman. It's good to be with you. This is my Astoria home right here behind me. And I do appreciate the introduction. I should also mention, in deference to our co-host, Samuel Rosenthal, that I also sponsored with her the cat declawing bill, which is the first in the nation law. That's right. But we're here to talk about housing today. I think you set it up nicely. Senator Hoylman has been very active on this issue and is a great colleague. We have been focused in New York, the governor in particular, especially on the health consequences of what's happening. That should be first on everybody's list, of course, but it has cascaded into an economic and humanitarian catastrophe that is now unfolding. We have told people by the millions that their jobs are no longer available to them, with good reason. I understand and support the need to keep the businesses closed that are closed currently. But what we didn't do is think about the next step, which is all these people, many of whom live paycheck to paycheck, suddenly no longer have a paycheck, and that's by order of the government. It's government's responsibility, in my view, to then provide that their financial obligations should be paused, just like their jobs are paused. And people's number one financial debt is typically their rent payment every month. We blew past April 1st. This bill was introduced in March. And now in just a few short days, May 1st is going to be upon us. And we have to do something. Unfortunately, when we were up to work on the budget, we did not consider any non-budgetary bills. And so this was unable to get a vote at that time. We are now contemplating our return to session. Brad and I were on a call just a few days ago where I was certainly left with the impression that we will be back in a matter of weeks and hopefully be able to do something at that time. I have also asked for the governor to act by executive order because he can do that at any time. He doesn't have to wait for the legislature to act, given that we're in an emergency and he has enhanced authority to do that. And interestingly, his comments have shifted in a good way. Not fast enough, in my opinion, but he started out, he gets this question a lot on his morning briefings that everybody watches. And he started out by saying the eviction moratorium he established takes care of the rent issue, I think, was the language he used. And the last time he was asked about it, I think it might have been yesterday or the day before, like everybody else, I'm losing track of it. But at that point, he said, everything's on the table. We're looking at what we need to do in addition to what's already in place. So that's encouraging, but still too slow. This is a problem that's now affected people for a month already, and we're about to enter month 2. So hopefully we'll continue to build support. We do have 23 sponsors on the Senate side, 32 is a majority. We have colleagues who care a great deal about preserving housing opportunities for people who have other ideas. And we're in the process now of just trying to figure out how to merge all these ideas into something that can get consensus in the Senate.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal in my Upper West Side apartment, which I represent in the New York State Assembly. You know, the problem with the rent and everything else that's going on here exposes that our social safety net is full of holes and people are frantic. And I totally understand that. My office gets emails and calls and people, there's unemployment issues, but then there's like, I can't pay my rent. What will happen to me? And then we do get a smattering of smaller landlords who say, they're not going to pay the rent and I'm going to have to pay property taxes. So this is a spiral that is affecting everybody. And that's why we've invited Sam Himmelstein to be on this call. Maybe many of our viewers will know Sam. He is a tenant lawyer extraordinaire. Often my office turns to him and his colleagues in his law firm and say, what do you think of this idea? What do you think about this problem? And that's because he's been to court for years and years. He's not just a tenant attorney, though. He is a Wilco fan, Rolling Stones, has a band, the Love Handles, but we have him on tonight because of his vast knowledge, decades of knowledge about tenants rights, organizing, and what he thinks the future holds. So Sam.
Hi, everybody. So I was going to sing a song, but I guess that's not my role tonight. So,
not tonight.
Coming to you from Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn, instead of Maiden Lane. So as I was telling my co-panelists before we went on, I've been in private practice for 37 years. I've never seen a deluge of inquiries to my law firm on basically the same topic, which is people are emailing us and calling us and wanting to talk to people about saying basically the same thing. I've lost my job. My spouse and I have lost our job. My roommates and I have lost their jobs. We can't pay our rent. And then the questions branch off into what happens to me if I stay in place? Will I be evicted? What happens to me if I leave the city and I've got a year left on my lease? Will I for damages for breach of lease? And I literally spend hours a day on the phone telling people what the news is about this. And it's a mix of good and bad news. So the eviction moratorium, as was pointed out earlier, is not a rent suspension, as some people seem to think. The eviction moratorium really simply stopped evictions for people who were already in court and could have been evicted as a result of those cases being processed. But the other things that are going on is that the courts closed on, I believe, March 16th for all except emergency filings. So that means if you've been locked out of your apartment by your landlord, or you have really, really serious conditions like no heat, no hot water, you can still go to court. But other than that, nobody can go to court. And that means your landlord can't go to court. So the good news is that you are in no immediate danger. Nothing can be filed against you until the courts reopen, and we don't think that's going to happen for several months at the earliest. The question then becomes, what happens if I am brought into court? And there are some defenses that tenants can raise in these cases. We're not sure that they directly apply to the case at hand, but certainly I cannot believe that the courts are not going to be in some way sympathetic to tenants and not going to want to be on the front page of the New York Post as ordering mass evictions of people who couldn't pay their rent because of the COVID crisis. So in many of those cases, my guess is that people will be able to work out some kind of agreement, plan, reduction, deferral of the rent, some kind of settlement. The bad side is what I'm hearing from people who are trying to negotiate with their landlords is that landlords are being landlords, which means that they are by and large not agreeing to lower people's rent. They're not agreeing to forgive a month or two's rent. They are at best offering what we call a deferral, which is to spread the rent arrears over the course of the remainder of the lease, which doesn't really help people very much if they are unemployed and they don't have a reasonable prospect of being reemployed. So I'm assuming a lot of the questions will focus on this, and I'm happy to answer specifics as they come in.
Thank you, Sam. And our final guest is Rebecca Garrard. She is campaigns manager for housing justice with Citizen Action of New York. And she also serves on the steering committee of the Housing Justice for All Coalition. She works to secure rights for all New Yorkers across the state. She fights for New Yorkers who are tenants, who are rent burdened, and that's really increased now, for safe, affordable housing, as well as housing security for the 90,000 plus New Yorkers who are experiencing homelessness. Before she entered her housing campaign work, she was in labor organizing. Rebecca, thanks for being here.
Thanks to all of you for having me on. Yes, I think we knew that we had a housing crisis prior to this pandemic. We knew that over 50% of tenants were rent burdened, and we're already one small crisis away from not being able to afford their rent and being displaced or evicted or homeless. And we have, as you said, over 90,000 people homeless on any given day in this state. And so what this pandemic has really shown us is that we were already operating in a system where housing security in New York really didn't exist. And so that has led us to this situation where we have, nationally, we had over 30% of people who could not pay their rent on April 1st, and that number will have increased dramatically as of May 1st. And we are screaming towards a humanitarian crisis. And so while the eviction moratorium sort of staved that off and kicked the can down the road, it really hasn't provided a solution as to how we're going to get out of that moment. It has just sort of delayed it. And so what we know is that even if deferment or other such mechanisms are put in place, that's not going to be realistic for the tenants of this state. They're not going to be able to make up the rents that are due over an extended period of time because they were already rent burdened and they don't have savings to draw upon, and their future employment is not going to allow them to recoup the monies that they've lost over this period. And so we need to really be thinking about solutions that erase the debt that is occurring during this pandemic for tenants. And we need to do it quickly. And we need the governor to act with the executive power that he has afforded himself to make that happen. so that we don't end up with the over 90,000 people we have experiencing homelessness grow exponentially into a number that is something unprecedented and cannot be allowed in a state this great and cannot be tolerated, right, by any of our legislators in New York.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So Mike, it seems like every 6 months there's a bill that maybe a legislator might propose that captures the public's imagination and becomes a rallying cry for so many of our progressive causes up in Albany. I think that at this juncture, it's safe to assume the cancel rent legislation that you introduced is that bill. And you think about this crisis, and I think the normal rules don't apply to anything, and that's certainly the case when it should come to rent, given the economic circumstances that so many New Yorkers find themselves in. What prompted you, though, to introduce the bill? What does it do, and how do you think we get there in terms of either convincing the governor or our colleagues to support it?
Well, it's kind of the same answer to both of those questions. What prompted me to introduce the bill was people. It was like an exercise in democracy. I represent tens of thousands of tenants who are in fear and are in a panic about what they're supposed to do. This seemed like the most logical thing. You heard Rebecca and others just say that the only thing that will provide relief is an actual cancellation of the obligation. Now, I'm fine if the federal government wants to come in and some stimulus package pay for everybody's rent. That would take care of the problem, I suppose. But I'm not counting on this U.S. Senate and this president to sign on to something like that. And I certainly am not going to just say, let's hope that happens and throw caution to the wind in terms of trying to help people. My view is, and I want to address a couple of questions I've heard in the course of the last month or so pushing this, but my view is if the government can tell people that their job is canceled, the government can tell people that their rent is canceled. And by the way, the government can also tell landlords that their mortgages are canceled, at least for people that have mortgages with state chartered banks. We should absolutely consider doing that for homeowners that would be in need if rent is not coming in either. But there has been this question that I want to settle about legality of all of this. And it is pretty clear, in my view, that going back 100 years, there are Supreme Court decisions in this country that say that the contract clause can be superseded by the state's police powers, especially in an emergency, and especially when the solution is temporary. So if we're talking about we're canceling rent for a 90-day period because of the emergency we're obviously in, I have great confidence that that would pass legal muster, and it's something that we can do. What can people do to kind of convince the governor? I think it's happening. I mentioned earlier, I believe his views on this are changing for the better. But the more he believes that there are millions of people who want this, the outcry you mentioned earlier that has made this a cause, the more we can continue to push that, and the more he hears from people that he represents in the state, this is something they need, I think we'll be moving in the right direction.
And could you describe the mortgage part of the bill?
Yeah, well, the bill says that if you've lost income because of, and let me just take a step back for a second. The bill was introduced before even the first federal stimulus, right? So we were living in a world where there was no assistance coming beyond typical ones for people. And it said that if you've lost income because of the shutdowns that the government has ordered, your rent is canceled for 90 days. It then said if you are a homeowner who would be put in a financially precarious situation because you would lose that rental income, then your mortgage payments would also be canceled in coordination with how, in other words, in the same ratio that you lost rental income from your property, your mortgage payment would also be canceled. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we only have the ability to do that. We only have that jurisdiction over state chartered banks. So that is an issue that we will need federal assistance for ultimately to deal with people who hold mortgages with federally chartered banks. But it was an effort to recognize that there may be some homeowners, particularly the small ones. No one's looking to help the Jared Kushners of the world here, or the big players that can handle it, which is why we built in financial hardship requirement on the mortgage forgiveness side. But we do want to take into account that there are some small homeowners out there who would be put out if they're not receiving rent. And the other thing I would say, which I keep stressing to these people say, I can't lose my rent. You are losing your rent anyway. This is happening because people don't have money, and they don't have money because they don't have a job. They don't have a job because the government shut down all these businesses. And so the rent is being canceled. It's happening nationwide. A third of rental payments were not made in April. That's going to be higher in May, I'm sure. And I'm sure the numbers in New York are even way higher than that because we're at the center of all of this. So the rent money is not coming in for them one way or the other. Either we're going to set up a situation that I think Rebecca mentioned earlier, that at the end of this 90-day period, and Sam can speak to this too, we're going to see thousands of eviction proceedings start moving forward whenever the courts open up, I guess. Or we're going to set up a legal structure that allows the recovery to be that much faster and that much smoother if we establish some legal boundaries that give people comfort and security in their home.
Thank you.
So Sam, so as we said earlier, New York has taken housing related actions. The governor has a 90-day eviction moratorium, which is now a little longer till June 20th. Can you describe what you think will happen once the moratorium expires? What will happen in the courts? And what do you think landlords would do? I must say also, some landlords that we've spoken, the tenants we've spoken to, said landlords don't care. And they're saying pay your rent or else. And this is a very hard stance from some of them. Mm-hmm. What do you see in your work?
It's very hard to predict, but I do believe that there will be a flood of cases in the courts once they reopen, even if half the landlords decide to pursue this. But as Senator Gianaris pointed out, at the end of the day, what are landlords going to gain by bringing eviction cases against their tenants? In many cases, these are tenants who've lived in their apartment for years, paid their rent on time for years. They're mortified and embarrassed by the fact that they can't pay their rent. What good does it do to evict those people who are trying to get on their feet again, when even if you manage to evict them, who are you going to replace them with? And you're probably going to end up, as Senator Gianaris said, with a judgment which is an empty piece of paper, because so many of these people that are calling me have no assets. They have no money. They have no money in the bank. These are people who are living, as we know, I think it's 80% of Americans live check to check and don't have substantial savings saved up for an emergency. So, you get a judgment against somebody, you have to have some assets to go after to collect it, like garnishing wages or seizing real estate or freezing someone's bank account. But if there's $3 in the bank, it's not going to do you any good. So I'm hoping that landlords act logically in these situations, but I've been a tenant lawyer long enough to know that may not happen. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon us, when I say us, tenant lawyers, coming up with creative ways to interpose existing defenses to these cases and asking the courts to expand them to this unprecedented situation. Because, the courts do sometimes respond to changing social conditions, not always, but given the extremity of this situation, perhaps, doctrines like impossibility of performance, frustration of purpose, and you can Google those if you want to know what they mean, could be used in this situation where they historically have not. The other thing is that I believe in the legislation that you all passed in last June, judges were given, the way we're reading it is that judges were given discretion to impose longer periods than what had historically been allowed for tenants to pay the rent. It used to be if a tenant had a judgment against them, they had to pay in 5 days, and if not, the landlord could evict them. We read the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act to give judges the authority to extend that period, perhaps up to a year. So that might give people some relief, but it's really hard to predict. And the other thing is that the court administrators that we speak to are openly discussing the fact that when the courts reopen, they're going to try to do it on some gradual basis. In other words, not just open the courts suddenly and have the courts flooded with cases. And I think they're mainly doing that to protect their own interests and the interests of the clerk's offices that they manage. But somehow limiting the number of cases that could be filed per day, maybe opening it up gradually by zip code so that the courts and quite frankly, we tenant lawyers are not overwhelmed with, a flood of cases.
Some years ago, I passed a law that said tenants could pay their rent in any form that they desired, not meaning pennies, but check or online or cashier's check or whatever, cash. And we've already had cases where landlords have told their tenants, you must pay it with a bank check.
Oh,
And we told them, you can't by law, but this taking advantage in a crisis is really immoral.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I wonder if you could say, what have you heard around the state in terms of how people are grappling with the rent payments outside of the city and inside as well?
Yeah, I think it's pretty uniform, both inside of the city and outside of the city. We have some isolated cases of landlords being willing to negotiate, but we have just as many, if not more, instances of landlords using really harassing, predatory behaviors to force individuals into positions of choosing between feeding their families and accessing healthcare or paying their rent. And even though there's eviction moratorium, there are threatening letters that really push the line between delivering an eviction, which is disallowed, and basically threatening you're going to be out, which, it's hard for tenants sometimes to know what their rights are and how to implement them. And so that can feel to a tenant as the same thing as an eviction if you're not really well versed on the law and what that looks like. And so it's enormously problematic that we have some of these players moving that way. And I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that these players are our private equity landlords who are known to move in a way that is designed to extract the maximum amount of wealth from the communities in which they operate business. And I think it's really important for us in this moment as we look for solutions that triage this crisis, right? To also make sure that we're creating solutions that address the underlying systems that brought us to this crisis. Because if we had had housing systems and social safety net systems in general that provided communities with a different experience, we wouldn't be where we were, right? So it's really important that we don't provide interventions that get us through this moment, but ensure that the next time we have some sort of crisis, whether it's a climate crisis or something else along these lines, we're right back to where we were, but we begin to address the underlying issues that have brought us here. So we know.
Go ahead. No, finish. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so we know that, the private equity, private market housing system has failed this state, and it has created a population of tenants who are rent burdened in a way that has increased homelessness by over 40% in the last, since 2010, right? In the last 10 years. And it was unsustainable. And this has really just shown a white hot spotlight on that in a really accelerated manner. But we need to be really intentional in that when we implement these solutions, that they address not just the moment we're in, but what got us here, right? And everything that encompasses, right? We have, our communities lead intersectional lives. And so poverty presents itself in so many different ways, right? So we have our homeless populations who are criminalized and fuel the mass incarceration system. We have housing insecure who are unable to access jobs and educational opportunities. And so all of it is built into this intersectional failure on the part of our systems of God to address our communities and equitable access to really basic human rights and face disproportionate impacts.
That's a really good point, Rebecca. I mean, I think that a lot of advocates see this crisis, if there is a silver lining anywhere, it's that the fight for systemic change is really spotlighted by what we're seeing in the differential outcomes just in the last, few weeks and months. And, Mike, I wanted to turn to you about, because we're getting a lot of comments from our viewers, many of them landlords. Some of them say they're small landlords. They're portraying this as a war we're waging on them, rather than something that necessarily is a fight for tenants and for small landlords. Particularly, Masha is asking about non-residential tenants. She runs a nonprofit organization that isn't getting, understandably, as many donations and is struggling to pay the rent during this period. Will the cancel rent legislation help her?
Well, let me answer it this way, because as I mentioned earlier, the bill was introduced over a month ago, I think, at this point, before there was a federal stimulus, before a lot of the ramifications of this crisis were clear. There have been subsequent bills. I even introduced a subsequent bill to take a little bit of a different approach as we were trying to get something done during the budget week, which would absolutely include nonprofits in the solution. What we're in the process of doing now, as you know, Brad, is discussing with our colleagues what we can develop a consensus around. There's a lot of support behind the broad notion of canceling rent. But since this conversation started, we have heard from nonprofits. We've heard from small businesses. We've heard from small landlords and homeowners who we absolutely should help if we have the ability to do so, and they are in need. What I'm trying to do here, and I think in the end, we'll hopefully get 32 votes around the Senate, and Linda can do some good work in the Assembly, is something that takes all this into account. Oftentimes, a dramatic reform is begun with an idea that people comment on, and we usually have more time than we have here because of the immediacy of the crisis. But even the housing laws last year, there were a number of bills. I had one of them. It all got put into the legislative process. We came out with something at the end of the session that incorporated a lot of it and made some changes based on comments. That's what's going to happen here as well if we're able to get across the finish line, which we absolutely need to do. And so I would hope that all of the people in need can receive help. What I like to say is I'm trying to start this process, start this conversation with the people at the bottom, on the bottom rung of the economic ladder, people who live paycheck to paycheck, people who need the help the most, people who, when we're telling them you got to stay home, don't know if they're going to have a home because their rent obligations are continuing to accrue. Let's start and say, okay, those people are protected first and foremost. Next up, the small homeowners who need that rent to survive themselves. Let's do something for them. There's going to be pain, economic pain, as a result of what's happening right now. There's no question about it, and it's going to be massive. Typically, all of that burden falls on the people who can least help themselves. And so I'm trying to say, let's start from the bottom up. Let's help the people who need it and push this pain as far up the economic ladder as we can. because you know what's going to happen ultimately. The big banks and the big real estate companies, they'll take advantage of whatever the federal government does because they always do. Either it's written for them or they have the fancy lawyers that can figure it out. No offense then to the fancy lawyers out there. And they're going to be just fine at the end of this, just like in the banking crisis a decade ago. The banks ended up fine and the average person got screwed. So what I'm trying to do is get the state to a point where protecting the everyday New Yorkers who need the help, and then push the sacrifice up to the people who can best handle it.
Thank you. No, I mean, I just want to add, like, I can't imagine what it must be like for some of our constituents who call our offices, who, you know, are battling illness, who are unemployed, who have kids at home because of the homeschooling order, and have lost loved ones, yet they have the rent due. I mean, the pressures on New Yorkers, particularly tenants, in a situation like that are unimaginable. Sam, you must hear this from
Every day. And, you know, I get the feeling that the landlords are really well organized in their response to this, not the small mom and pop landlords, but the big private equity companies. The uniformity of the response that I hear when tenants propose, give me a break, forgive a month's rent, reduce my rent by half for a few months, it leads me to believe that they are being, you know, counseled by REBNY and the RSA and CHIP to respond a certain way. And, you know, for those of you who are around in the 60s, and I may be the only one here, I think they're afraid of the domino effect. You know, if they make an agreement with one tenant, they seem to be afraid that that tenant's going to spread the word in the building and say, hey, you know, you can get something off your rent. And the other thing I hear is that, you know, there's a lot of accusations that people are taking advantage of the crisis, which is just nonsense. I honestly believe that every single person that has called my firm has said they're in economic hardship. No one has called my firm and said, hey, there's a crisis and I hear I can get something off the rent, right? But I do think the landlords are well organized, and that's why we have to be well organized, so.
Sam, I wanted to follow up. HRA is not processing one-shot deals unless there's an eviction notice. Do you think it makes sense for the city to make one-shot deals? And secondly, and I will ask this of Rebecca as well, the Rent Guidelines Board met and started reviewing data on whether or not landlords are entitled to a rent increase. So what is your take on the call by the mayor and others that RGB should not have any rent increase this year for the following year? And what do you think the Rent Guidelines Board will do? That's three questions.
So as to the HRA issue, of course, they should be, if anything, loosening the restrictions on one-shot deals, not tightening them. I mean, there is some rationality to the fact that, you know, if someone isn't on the verge of an eviction, you don't issue a one-shot deal. But HRA is, I think they're committing suicide by not processing these claims now, because they, like everyone else, are going to end up being overwhelmed by this if and when the courts open. So, and I don't know what their staffing is. I don't know if they're working up to capacity. I don't know if, you know, they have the ability to process all these applications, but it seems to me that to be, you know, taking the position that unless you're on the verge of eviction, you can't get a one-shot deal just isn't rational at this point. So.
And the Rent Guidelines Board question? Sam and then Rebecca, same question.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Rent Guidelines Board should be looking at, for the first time in its history, reducing the rent for rent stabilized tenants. They have that power. They just issue a preliminary report which recommended 2.5% to 3.5% increases.
Yes.
Excuse the expression, but that's borderline criminal to me in this situation. You know, for some people, that's a big increase. You know, if you're paying $3,000, $2,500 a month and you're suddenly being told you have to pay a 3.5% increase, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm kind of flabbergasted. And I think we should be pushing for not just a freeze, but a rollback.
Yes. Rebecca?
Yeah, and I'd love to answer that too. I think I'm in 100% agreement for rent stabilized tenants that the idea of an increase is unconscionable, and completely agree with Sam that a negative number would be the appropriate amount in this situation. And then when we think about our unregulated tenants, they are completely vulnerable in this moment if we did have a situation of cancel rent, to have landlords implement recouping that loss in the form of a rent increase post whatever time period that cancel rent occurred during, right? And for me, it just really highlights some of the legislative things that we did not win last year that we absolutely could and should win this year, such as good cause eviction for unregulated tenants, which would prevent retaliatory evictions for, say, those who are participating in a rent strike, and would limit rent increases to those to at least a reasonable number, right? I mean, they'll still be subjected to rent increases, but at least it would be capped and not aligned with something that would allow for the recouping of the loss if cancel rent were to be implemented. And in addition, we should have an elimination of MCIs, because even if we have an RGB 0% or a negative %, we know that those are the mechanisms that are still in place that allow for regulated tenants to have their rents increase in a manner that is not going to be affordable at this moment, especially, but was never affordable. And so those are legislative fixes in this moment that don't have a monetary ask to them, that should be implemented, and we would ask to be implemented.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
One of the things that tenants statewide need to understand also is that thanks to the 3 legislators on this call and others, if a landlord wants to raise your rent more than 5% now, or wants to obtain possession of your apartment,
there's an extended time period.
Possession for more than a year, you're entitled to a 6 notice.
Yeah.
And you're in possession more than 2 years, you're entitled to a 90-day notice. So a landlord can't just spring a rent increase or a non-renewal of lease on you at the last moment.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
Well,
But
Mike, what did you want to say?
need so much more.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because one thing I want to stress is both the governor and the mayor are not thinking big enough, in my opinion. The governor's talking about an eviction moratorium. It was a good step at the outset. We need to do more. He's starting to talk like he gets it. I hope he does. The mayor's talking about a rent freeze for rent stabilized units. If I'm not mistaken, Sam, the Rent Guidelines Board had 0% increases in the past, without a crisis being in place. I mean, the housing crisis exists constantly, but so, I mean, these are relatively small ball solutions to an unprecedented crisis. And so we've got to get to the point where we're actually helping people, not just doing the minimum necessary to get the burden off of their shoulders. And that's why we really need this groundswell of affected people to continue to mobilize around this, because that's the only way that a system that is geared towards doing the minimum necessary to not get too much blowback from the real estate industry is going to move if the people rise up and do something. That's what happened last year around the rent stabilization laws, and we need that now more than ever with so many more people being affected by this.
Mike, obviously this is a problem that's not limited to the New York real estate market. And I know that tenants in California are angry that Governor Newsom issued a moratorium on evictions, but similar to New York's, it'll run out. And then on the day after, in theory, landlords could file for evictions of tenants. One of the bills that I introduced with Senator Krueger, I think we call it the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which would give tenants 6 months beyond the end of the state of emergency to start repaying their rent. I think it could work in tandem with a rent cancellation bill like yours. But are you hearing from other legislators in other states about similar movements? Are you familiar with it? Like in New Jersey, surely they have the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing it a lot. You're not seeing a lot of action. I think we're ahead of most states in terms of action in this regard, even though we haven't actually done anything yet, but just in terms of where we're at in terms of the legislative process. You're seeing some municipalities move more aggressively, but they don't often have the power to do anything. I believe the Seattle City Council passed a resolution calling for rent to be canceled, but they just kicked it up to their state legislature also. New Jersey did pass something through their Senate that essentially calls for the federal government to provide money to solve the problem, and then has a backup of a certain amount of state money that would kick in if the federal money doesn't cover it. So different places are trying to attack this from different approaches. The cancel rent movement is national in scope. Everyone from Bernie Sanders, who you would expect, to Vice President Biden has said they support rent forgiveness during this time period. And so there's a recognition of the scope of the problem in some quarters. The issue is we have to do enough to get it actually enacted and accomplished. And that's where we're at right now.
I know you have a lot of great restaurants in your district, as Linda and I have in ours. And we're getting questions about whether the cancel rent bill would apply to commercial tenants like local independent businesses or neighborhood restaurants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. The bill contemplates that what is defined as a small business would qualify, which is 100 employees or less.
And just to say, there's a really moving piece in today's New York Times by a woman named Gabrielle Hamilton, the chef and owner of Prune in the East Village, that closed after 20 years, in part due to a rent burden. I would encourage people to read it, but it's a spotlight of the economic hardship that everyone's facing.
We're getting calls in the office about people whose leases are expiring, whether they should renew it or not. And then we're also getting, and you've read something about this, that people in abusive situations are now stuck. So, Sam, what would you say about whether people should renew their leases now? And also they have roommate issues. They want to get rid of the roommate, but now there's no evictions, right?
Right, yes.
So what happens with that?
Yeah, so, whether you should renew your lease is really an individual situation depending on your circumstances. What I've been counseling people to do is, what I've been telling people to do is, if you feel like you have enough economic security to renew your lease, you should definitely do that because it'll keep you in place for another year or two. But if you're running out of money, renewing a lease is a mistake because it theoretically locks you in for the duration of the lease, subject, of course, to whatever defenses you might have and the landlord's obligation to mitigate. I've also been suggesting to people, but I don't know how many landlords are agreeing to this, that if you renew your lease, see if you can get the landlord to agree that you can cancel it on, say, 60 days notice. Some landlords will agree to that. Tenants should also remember, and I don't know how significant this is right now, that there is a general right to sublet and assign in New York, contained in New York Real Property Law 226B. So if you are in a situation where you're in a lease and you need to get out of it, one thing you can do is request to either sublet or assign your lease. Now, of course, that's going to be just as difficult under current circumstances as landlords saying they are having problems renting to new tenants. You're going to have trouble finding a tenant. But if you can find a replacement tenant when you need to get out of your lease, that provides you with a defense if the landlord should ever decide to sue you. And I have seen cases where tenants have provided what seems like a financially viable replacement and the landlords have turned them down. And what I tell people is, in some ways that's good news because you now may not be able to be sued. The roommate situation, I think because of what's going on and everybody being cooped up together, and you have a lot of situations in New York, which has happened over recent years because you have these matching services that have put roommates together who didn't previously know each other. The tensions are just rising, visibly. I'm getting calls like this every day. My roommate isn't respecting the COVID guidelines. My roommate is bringing in people from outside. Unfortunately, tenants are stuck in the same situation as the rest of us. Whereas they normally could, if they wanted to, start an eviction case against the roommate, they can't now. And, you know, there's no way out of it. I've been suggesting to people that they consider mediation services to try to work these things out, or, you know, seeing some sort of a counselor, because you're going to be stuck with each other for the foreseeable future.
Rebecca, you mentioned market rate tenants early on. I wonder if you could delve more into that, and also what are your thoughts about a rent strike?
So for unregulated tenants, the crisis is that much more real. So not to minimize the crisis that regulated tenants are experiencing, but there are inherently more protections embedded into that. And so for the 5 million unregulated tenants we have in New York, the difficulty is that they are subject not just to non-payment evictions, but they are subject to holdover evictions or no fault evictions. And so protections against specific types of evictions are of no benefit to them. And so even with an eviction moratorium, in addition, Sam pointed out that there is an extended timeline that is afforded to these tenants in terms of increases. But those eviction procedures can be subverted, right? And manipulated and perverted by implementing a rent increase that is unaffordable and equivalent to an eviction, right? So you could say, okay, I'm not evicting you because there's a moratorium on, but I'm giving you a rent increase that is 100% of your rent. And that is the equivalent to a rent increase. And yes, the guidelines could give you up to 90 days if you've been there 2 years or longer, but the fragility of that situation for tenants cannot be understated. It just cannot be understated. And so there have to be mechanisms that don't just triage the crisis we're in, but address the underlying foundations that have put these 5 million tenants across New York State, which includes 1.5 million tenants in New York City. This is not an outside of New York City problem. This is 1.5 million New York City tenants who are unregulated, who are in these exact situations, right? And we have a heavier percentage of tenants who don't possess leases outside of New York City and are month to month, so they're in a more precarious situation. But those rent increases apply to unregulated tenants at the end of a lease in New York City. And so we have to be thinking really holistically when we think about solutions to ensure that we're not just getting us through the next few months, but ensuring that we're dealing with a different type of crisis on the other side of that, and that we're building in systems and mechanisms that protect everyone. And so again, that's why I mentioned good cause, MCIs. It's why I mentioned the intersection, right, of our populations that are homeless and how that is criminalized, our people being released from populations through clemency, from jail and prisons, who are going into housing insecure situations and who could be cited as reoffenders because they don't have housing insecurity. We need to really be looking in a narrow focus, but we need to be looking in a really global focus.
Yeah. Mike, what's your take on a rent strike? You think it's going to come down to that, or?
I mean, I'll fall back to what I said earlier, whether it's a strike or people are just not paying because they don't have any money with which to pay. I think that landlords have to start getting their heads around the fact that there's just an unprecedented necessity to deal with this problem, other than just saying no, are hoping the federal government rides in and pays everybody, because you're going to hit May 1st and people are not going to pay. You know, they're just not. And whether they're doing it on principle or they're doing it because they don't have a penny in their pocket, you're going to see a non-payment of rent, the likes of which we've never seen before. And so we either are going to, I'll say again, we're either going to put some structure around that, or else you're going to deal with the summer or fall, whenever this blows over, massive eviction proceedings, massive debt burdens on tenants, probably foreclosure proceedings that would follow that for some people. The housing crisis, we've had a housing crisis in New York for a long time. We're the most expensive places to live in the world. But what you're going to see a few months down the road is going to put that to shame in terms of how severe it's going to be if we don't deal with this and deal with it soon.
Yeah, so whatever you call it, yeah, there's going to be some non-payment of rent. It could be a strike, or it could just be people not having the money. James is asking about getting out of a lease. He signed a lease in January that was scheduled to begin on May 1st. He already paid the first month rent and security deposit, but now he can't afford the new apartment. Does he have any chance of getting his security deposit back, you think?
Very unlikely. The best I think people can hope for in that situation is to get out of the lease. That should be their number one goal. I haven't yet seen a landlord voluntarily return a security deposit in that situation. And to be honest, legally, he's not in the greatest shape. So people in that situation have to make it really, really clear as soon as possible that they are not going to be able to carry through with their obligations under the lease, so that the landlord can begin making efforts to re-rent the apartment and discharge their duty to mitigate.
Yeah.
The thing I advise people to do in these situations is, if you do breach your lease and you walk away and the landlord is going to threaten to sue you for it, you need to monitor the internet for the same sources where you rented the apartment. So let's say you found it on StreetEasy. If you don't see that apartment pop up within 3 weeks or a month after you give it up, or you see the landlord trying to rent it at a higher rent, then the landlord is not mitigating their damages, and that might give you a defense to the payment of the rent.
And then let me squeeze in one more question because we're running out of time. Bridget is asking about rent stabilized units. She and her elderly mother both live in rent stabilized units, but they had to leave New York City, understandably, because of COVID. Could they get evicted because of the non-primary residence laws?
Good question. I get asked that a lot. In general, non-primary residence looks at physical occupancy and are you in possession of the apartment more than half the time? But the courts have carved out many, many exceptions to that. So for example, even before this, if you were in Florida taking care of your sick mom and dad who needed your assistance, the courts would not evict you for non-primary residence. If you were a musician traveling on the road and you didn't have other residents, you would not be evicted. And the unanimous view in my firm is that if people relocate out of New York out of a need to protect their health and safety, no judge would evict them based on non-primary residence for that reason, so long as they return when the crisis abates.
Do you think we need it? Do you think we need to codify that?
I don't, because the case law is the case law precedent is really, really good on that.
Thank you.
We got a quick question from Anne. A rent stabilized tenant died last week and his caregiver was with him for 9 years. Does he have any protections?
If that person can establish that they had an emotionally and financially interdependent relationship with the tenant of record, and I can't go into what that constitutes now, but it's if you Google it on the DHCR website, you'll find what the regulations are and what it requires. And it was the primary residence of both the caretaker and the tenant prior to the tenant's death, and the period's either 1 year or 2 years, depending on how old the successor is. The caretaker could claim that possession to the apartment. And there was a recent case in New York County about 4 months ago that actually held that in a very similar circumstance.
Maybe the caregiver has rent money. Who knows?
Maybe.
Yes. Okay, Brad?
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our hour. I want to thank all of our guests, Sam, Rebecca, of course, Mike, and wanted to also thank our team who's helped us with sign language interpretation. We really appreciate your assistance. This is a enormous problem, and Mike, I really like how you are insisting that we think much larger than the solutions that have been offered so far. So
Can
thank
I
you.
add a final comment, Brad? I'm sorry.
Yes, please, indeed. That's why I'm turning it over to you.
I'm sure there are some landlords who are tuning in to hear, what we're going to say as well. And I hear them, but there is a sacrifice and a shared sacrifice that's required right now. And a lot of them will say, well, I rely on my rent payment to get by, or this is my business, this is how I make money. Well, guess what? The restaurant owner relied on his business too. And the person who's your tenant relied on their income from the jobs that they no longer have too. So it's not enough to be like, well, I'm going to protect my piece of this pie and everyone else can go screw themselves. Okay, we've all got to try and work together to get somewhere that helps everybody, or else we're all going to go down together. And so I also want to thank your interpreter, Brad, who I think is this way in the box, who you may notice from the mornings when he's on with the mayor doing the briefing. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah. And Mike, I think you are responsive to a lot of the comments we're getting from landlords tonight. So I appreciate that. Linda?
Yeah, I'd also like to thank Mike. We're working on some more animal bills together. Look for that. Sam, who his firm is Himmelstein, McConnell, Gribben, Donahue, and Joseph. The hour you spent with us, thank you for doing it pro bono. We always appreciate your input on housing issues. And Rebecca, you keep fighting the good fight with citizen action and making sure that people around the state know their rights and that hold legislators accountable to give them even more. And that's what we intend to do. So perhaps we'll address this in the upcoming. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said much appreciation.
Yeah.
Statewide
we
movement.
might address this again because this is a very crucial topic. So I thank everyone for watching.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Night.